Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, the summer has seen the housing and homelessness emergency go from disaster to calamity. The most recent homelessness figures show that the number of homeless individuals now stands at nearly 10,000 people. The number of families accessing emergency accommodation stands at 1,778. That's 349 more families than the same month last year. Scandalously, the number of homeless children has increased again. There are now 3,867 children sleeping in emergency accommodation. And service providers are reduced to referring families to Garda stations due to the lack of emergency accommodation. In the course of the summer, we witnessed the indignity of a family of 7 sleeping in Tala Garda station. Rental costs have spiralled out of control, house prices continue to be above affordable levels, and tens of thousands of homes lie vacant across the state. So naturally, people have responded, and some have come out to protest against your government's failures. And the response? A heavy-handed overreaction to a peaceful occupation of a building in my own constituency that had laid empty for 3 years. A private security firm arriving in unmarked cars, escorted by Gardaí to evict a handful of peaceful protesters. An absolutely disproportionate response. Contrast that with your own response to the housing crisis, Taoiseach, a response that is underwhelming, under-resourced and inadequate. Your flagship housing policy, Rebuilding Ireland, has been in place now for 2 years, and yet the crisis deepens. Instead of getting to grips with the emergency, you attack local authorities, you attack opposition deputies, and fail to see your own failures in government. Spin over substance, a refusal to accept that your policies are failing, that is the hallmark of your approach. We desperately need a change of direction and a change of policy, and that means taking bold and urgent action. So I want to recommend such an action to you. Sinn Féin has proposed the introduction of a temporary tax relief for renters alongside a 3-year emergency rent freeze. Existing tenancies would have their rents frozen at their current levels, and new tenancies would be pegged to the RTB's average rent index. Now this would be a good move, Taoiseach. This would be a response, a partial response to the crisis that we face. So I want to ask you, will you introduce such a rent freeze?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge on behalf of the Government and everyone on this side of the House the extent to which we share the concerns of everyone in this country and the opposition when it comes to the impact that the housing shortage and the homelessness crisis is having on people across Ireland. It's something we all know about from our constituency clinics, from the increased workload, the increased numbers of housing queries coming through. It's something we know about it from the experiences of people we meet, and indeed, in many cases, our family and friends. Whether it's young couples who are struggling to buy their first home, in many cases now paying more in rent than they would pay if they were able to buy, have a mortgage approved but are unable to find the right property or enough properties to choose from, people who are waiting years on the housing lists, people who have been forced into emergency accommodation. So the solution to this can only be increased supply. Or rather, I shouldn't say only, but a big part of the solution has to be increased supply. And we are now seeing increased supply. In the last 3 months alone, figures from the CSO, which I believe everyone trusts, or they should anyway, show that 4,500 new homes were built in the last quarter. 4,500 new homes built in the space of 3 months. And behind that number are real stories and real people. 4,500 families moving into a newly built house or apartment, and in many cases freeing up 4,000 or 5,000 other properties for other people to buy or to rent. We anticipate that about 20,000 new homes will be built this year. Certainly 20,000 if you include vacant properties being brought back into use and student accommodation, and that will be up from 14,500 last year, up from 9,000 the year before, up from about 5,000 the year before that. So I don't think anyone can doubt that we're in the right trajectory when it comes to providing more houses and more housing supply. It's definite, it's a fact that supply is now increasing. But it's not enough, and we acknowledge that. Our population last year increased by 65,000. And while that doesn't mean we need 65,000 new homes every year, it probably means we need about 30 or 35,000 new homes every year, and we're not there yet. But we are ramping up supply. We're doing everything we possibly can to ramp up supply, and if there are new additional measures that will allow us to increase supply, we're happy to consider them. But tinkering with other things around the edges doesn't produce supply. And while we'll certainly consider the proposals you've put forward, I can see that they would cost. Certainly any meaningful tax relief for renters would be expensive. We've been to see how you propose to fund that. But none of those things will actually increase supply. Ultimately, you'll have more people competing for the same number of units, and as our population rises, we're going to need more supply. In terms of protests, all I can say is that in a democracy, everyone has the right to protest, and protest is a very important part of a healthy democracy. But it is very much my view that protests, when they occur, should be peaceful, should be in accordance with the law, and should be respectful of the Gardaí, people who put their safety at risk to keep us and our communities safe. And local authorities have the power to CPO vacant properties. Many local authorities use their power to CPO vacant properties. And if a local authority isn't CPOing a vacant property, they're probably not doing that particular CPO for a reason. And I note that many of the protests are taking place in the central Dublin area, in the Dublin City area, and Sinn Féin and left-wing councillors dominate Dublin City Council. So I assume if Sinn Féin and left-wing dominated councils aren't CPOing properties in Dublin City Centre, they have a reason for that.
Deputy McDonald.
Taoiseach, the CPO process is long and arduous and all the rest of it. But let me just say this to you. You say that you're doing everything. You say that you are doing everything to increase supply. You say that you're doing everything to increase supply. You're not. I had occasion to visit an affordable or a social housing scheme in Cherry Orchard. Fantastic scheme, and an affordable one in Ballymun. And talking to the approved housing bodies, in the analysis of the current situation, they both said that they cannot understand all of the blockages and delays and red tape being placed in their way by government. In fact, some of them speculated and asked me, do they have some big announcement? Is there a rabbit to be pulled from the hat? The fact is, sadly, that there isn't. The truth is, when you talk to these approved housing bodies, the story they tell is one of delay and prevarication. When I put to you the idea of a rent freeze, this is a very necessary mechanism to prevent more homelessness. We know that the bulk of people now coming into homelessness and family homelessness are coming from the private rental sector. Now, your pressure zones and your approach hasn't worked. We need something that is actually fit for purpose. I'm not inviting you to tinker around the edges of anything. On the contrary, I'm asking you to take decisive action, and I'm putting it to you again that you need now to introduce a rent freeze. And I really hope that what Father Peter McVerry described as a conflict of interest that might be on your benches and your colleagues in government in Fianna Fáil wouldn't prevent you from introducing something as necessary as a 3-year rent freeze.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach, to conclude on this matter.
I can certainly assure the Deputy that I have no rabbits to pull out of the hat, and I have no quick fixes. This is not a problem that is going to be solved by an announcement or by some sort of quick fix measure or by changing one law or one piece of legislation. That is just not the case. Complex problems. To every complex problem, there's an easy and simple solution that probably doesn't work. And a rent freeze is probably one of those. We have rent pressure zones. They have brought about some control around the extent to which rents are increasing. They cap rent increases of 4%. We know from the last 2 ESRI reports that rents increased by around 1% each quarter in those areas. So there's at least some evidence initially that has helped to moderate the rate of increases. We have to bear in mind what a rent freeze might do. On the face of it, it sounds like a good idea, but think about the unintended consequences of that kind of a measure. Think, for example, what it would do to supply. Would more people be willing to rent out a property? Would more businesses be willing to build properties for rent if they're put in a situation whereby it's Sinn Féin and not them that decide what the rent charged is? Would people be willing to move from property to property? If you know people who live in rent-controlled cities, they say you have a rent-controlled apartment, hang on to it, don't move, and that means less churn, less people moving. And what often happens with those kind of measures is they work for some people, particularly those who are already in rented properties, but they make it harder, much harder, for people who are trying to rent for the first time. And that's why we need to always consider, when it comes to policies around housing, the unintended consequences. What might seem like a solution on the face of it, a simple, easy answer, might actually do harm to a lot of people.